Hello YouTube. As you may know, I've been doing a series on personal identity. As part of that series, I've occasionally mentioned certain mental disorders, particularly multiple personality disorder. And I thought it might be worth looking at this in a bit more detail. So today we'll look at two papers about multiple personality disorder, one by Kathleen Wilks, the other by Jeanette Kennett and Steve Matthews. I should say that the reason why I'm looking at these two papers in particular is simply that I had to give a presentation on them at university. This video is just based on that presentation. There's no other reason why I'm using these two papers, but they are interesting papers. Multiple personality disorder is today known as dissociative identity disorder. And I'll talk a bit more a bit later about why that name change occurred. But Kathleen Wilks's paper called Multiple Personality and Personal Identity, that was written in the early 80s before the name was changed. So I'll continue calling it multiple personality following her usage. Wilks examines the case of a woman called Christine Beauchamp, who was studied by the psychiatrist Morton Prince. Beauchamp saw Prince between 1898 and 1904, and she was one of the very first multiple personality cases. This was quite a complex case, so I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but you'll get the important features. You can look it up online or whatever if you want more detail. Beauchamp's troubles started in 1893 when she had a very traumatic experience one night working in a hospital. She was alone on a particular floor of the hospital, and it was a stormy night, so that's already a pretty disturbing environment, hospital during a storm, alone at night. Then she suffered three shocks. First of all, she saw a patient in a hospital gown suddenly appear, looking rather like a ghost, and the patient started attacking her. Shortly afterwards, after she got away from the patient, she heard a noise at the window. I think she was at the third floor of the building or something, and she saw a face at the window, illuminated by a lightning flash. In fact, it was her boyfriend who had used a ladder to climb up to the window of the floor where he knew she would be. But obviously for her, that was a bit of a shock. Finally, when her boyfriend came into the hospital, it seems that he raped her, and the rape was illuminated only by these flashes of lightning. So quite a bad night overall. 5 years later, a woman comes into Prince's offices who Prince calls B1. B1 was a refined and delicate person. Prince called her the saint. She was conscientious, patient, quiet, moral, religious, but she suffered from a kind of general nervous disorder, including insomnia, depression, fatigue, headaches and so on, and that's why she went to Prince. She wanted help with these mental troubles. Now, the standard treatment at the time was hypnosis, so Prince went to work hypnotising her. One day under hypnosis, a new personality emerges, who calls herself Sally. Sally claimed to have existed as a kind of co-consciousness with Christine Beauchamp since childhood. She was aware of everything that Beauchamp did, but was unable to act. Sally was totally different to B1. She was outgoing, merry, flirtatious, irresponsible. Nothing like this very sombre, saintly woman who first entered Prince's office. So it was as though there had been this other person living in Beauchamp's head, and who had finally come out. Sally was aware of all of B1's thoughts and actions. She could even describe B1's dreams in greater detail than B1 could. So Sally was always there, always observing, and Prince could kind of call her up by hypnotising B1. But one day Sally managed to wake up from the hypnosis, and from that point she was able to come out at will, as it were. So B1 would at times suddenly, without warning, switch into Sally. Now, although Sally knew everything about B1, B1 knew nothing of Sally. B1 simply had no memory of the times when Sally was out. So we can diagram it like this, where the blue arrow represents knowledge of thoughts and the green arrow represents knowledge of actions. Interestingly, Sally hated B1, which Prince speculated was perhaps due to jealousy. Sally was far less well educated. So that's quite interesting. Not only did Sally have a different personality, she seemed to have less intelligence and less skills. But she would often do things to make B1 miserable. She'd tear up her letters, conceal her money, destroy her work, and cause her to lose jobs and things like that. So one day a third personality emerged called B4. She remembered nothing since the traumatic event of 1893. She was impatient, aggressive, independent. Interestingly, Sally knew all of B4's actions, but not her thoughts. B4 knew nothing of Sally or B1, and B1 knew nothing of B4, so here's the diagram. After B4 learned about Sally, they ended up disliking each other, and they engaged in a fight, which B1 had to keep track of through letters that Sally and B4 wrote to each other. So you can see at this point that Beauchamp's body is starting to get rather crowded. Deeper hypnosis eventually produced B2. B2 claimed to be both B1 and B4 and knew all of their thoughts and actions. However, she knew nothing of Sally, though Sally knew all her thoughts and actions. Here's the diagram. Now, Prince assumed that B2 was the real Christine Beauchamp, since she was the most balanced and she could remember everything going back to childhood. The problem was that B2 never woke out of the hypnotic trance. Whenever Prince tried to wake her up out of hypnosis, she would always split into either B1 or B4. Prince wanted to bring B2 out and to give her full control, since he thought that this would restore Beauchamp to her original mental health. Of course, the other personalities weren't so happy about this prospect. As far as B1 and B4 were concerned, giving full control of the body to B2 meant that they would die. I mean, B1, being a very saintly person, wasn't really too bothered about this, but B4 was extremely resistant, and at one time tried to escape to Europe to stop it. For Sally, although she wouldn't die, it meant becoming passive yet again, which she was resistant to. But eventually, by 1904, the alternate personalities were suppressed. B2 was put in full control, presumably restoring the original Beauchamp. So that's a brief overview of the case of Christine Beauchamp, and as you can see from this diagram here, it's a bit complicated, but that sort of sums up how the different personalities were related to each other. It's a very strange case. Now, the question that occupies Wilks's article is, how many people were there in Christine Beauchamp's body between 1898 and 1904? Well, there are many reasons to think that there were a plurality of people. First, recall the psychological continuity view of personal identity. If we individuate persons by the continuity and coherence of psychology, then it looks like there are many people here. B1, B4 and Sally all had completely different, though internally consistent, characteristics, tastes, beliefs, habits, moods, skills, ambitions and so on. There was kind of more than one coherent set of psychological states and processes in Beauchamp's body. If any one of the personalities had been in complete control, then an outsider would assume her to be a normal person. So if Sally had been in control 100% of the time, then you would just treat her as a normal person. I mean, she certainly had her flaws. She was kind of impulsive and irresponsible. She wasn't very well educated. But of course, there are a lot of people who have flaws like that. So second, each was worthy of moral treatment. Lying to Sally would be just as wrong as lying to any other person. Similarly, each was treated as a moral agent. Each was worthy of moral praise and blame. Prince described how at one point B4 destroyed Sally's autobiography, and he criticised B4 for this. He held her to be morally responsible. Now, I think there are really 2 points to note here. First of all, it seems that only persons can be moral agents. It only makes sense to hold somebody morally responsible if they're a person. You wouldn't say that a lion who kills a human is morally responsible for that. The lion just doesn't have the kind of robust kind of capacities for personhood that we require when making moral judgments. And a second point, of course, is that, well, when Prince criticised B4 for destroying Sally's autobiography, that in itself would imply that they're different people, because there's nothing morally problematic about destroying your own autobiography, at least, in most circumstances. I mean, I guess if it's like evidence in court or something, then it would be morally wrong, but obviously that's a different kind of thing. If you've just written an autobiography just for fun and then you destroy it, nothing wrong with that. The fact that B4 wronged Sally by destroying the autobiography would suggest that they are two different people. Third, we can consider what it was like from the inside, as it were. What was it like from inside Christine Beaucamp's head? Well, B1, B2 and B4, as far as they were concerned, ceased to exist when another personality was out. The restoration of B2 was treated like death by B1 and B4. As for Sally, she didn't cease to exist, but she was pushed into the background. She was unable to act. At least that's what she claimed, at any rate. So I guess if you imagine being Christine Beaucamp, you can't really... It's not kind of coherent to imagine being all of these personalities at once. You can only be one or the other. And that would suggest that they're different persons. Final point is that we use the concept of persons to explain and predict behaviour. Humans are extremely complex entities. We don't respond to the world in merely mechanical ways, as it were. If you imagine a billiard ball, it's a matter of simple mechanics how that billiard ball will react to certain forces being applied to it. You can hit it with a pool cue at a certain force and it will go. You can say, okay, it's given the resistance of the table and the friction and so on and other factors. You can then predict pretty well where the billiard ball will go, how fast it will go, and things like that. Humans are not like that. We reflect, we deliberate, we have reasons for acting the way we do. We have to appeal to the concept of persons in order to make sense of ourselves and other people. And the important point here is that no amount of knowledge of, for example, B4, would have allowed us to predict or explain Sally's behaviour, and vice versa, right? So that looks like a pretty powerful reason for postulating more than one person here. However, Wilks thinks there are some serious problems with the judgment that Beaucamp was a plurality of persons. First of all, consider a computer with 4 different programs. If we ask of that computer, is it one thing or many? The answer is obvious, right? We say, well, as a piece of machinery, it's one thing. As a program, it's 4 things. There's nothing puzzling there. So, why shouldn't we just say, well, Christine Beaucamp is one body with 4 psychologies, and then leave it at that? Wilks says that the fundamental difference between computers and persons is that all of our norms and conventions of moral and social behaviour presuppose that there is a one-to-one relation between persons and bodies. All our social institutions are built around this assumption. Everywhere you go, every day, every interaction you have with other people, there is an implicit kind of assumption in the background that if there's one body, then there's one person. No such norms govern computers with respect to the relation between hardware and software. Now, I'm not entirely sure what Wilks' argument is on this point. I think what she's saying is that the very idea of having more than one person in one body just doesn't really make sense, given the social background, given the norms and institutions that we operate with. Let's say that you were married to Christine Beaucamp at the time. Well, you wouldn't be considered a polygamist just because there were these other personalities. Similarly, we wouldn't expect Beaucamp to carry 4 different passports. Maybe one way we can formalise this argument is to say, premise 1, personhood is socially constructed. So who counts as a person depends on the laws and institutions of the society in question. One of the big legal questions at the moment is whether we should extend personhood and the accompanying rights and legal protections to other great apes. To some extent, personhood is arguably a kind of social creation. But, premise 2, there is a very strong social norm that there is a one-to-one relation between persons and bodies. So, conclusion, there can never be more than one person in one body, at least not in our society. Other societies with different norms might allow it, but ours doesn't. Since personhood is a kind of social construction, it is kind of up to society, as it were, who counts as a person, and we've decided that one person, one body. Now I think this is a pretty questionable argument. Is personhood socially constructed? Well, obviously the laws and moral norms concerning personhood are socially constructed, but that doesn't mean that personhood itself is a social construction. In the same way, there are certain laws relating to mental incapacitation. Somebody who is under the influence of drugs or who is mentally retarded is considered to be unable to give legal consent to various things. So, I mean, to some extent, incapacitation, who counts as being incapacitated, is a kind of social construct. Different societies will draw the lines in different ways, but the sort of the kind of cognitive and mental states themselves aren't social constructs, right? The mental states that you enter into after you have, for instance, drunk alcohol, or if you are mentally retarded, that's not socially constructed. The second premise is also pretty questionable. I mean, we certainly make the assumption that there's one person to one body, generally, but that just, I mean, arguably that's just because in the vast majority of cases that's what we encounter. I mean, it's not clear to me that there are like norms, that there's a social norm enforcing this assumption. It's just a reasonable practical assumption, because that is the case in general, right? The vast majority of people we encounter have one person to one body, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a social norm enforcing that. So I think that's kind of questionable, this argument, although I may have misinterpreted what Wilks was getting at here. So second, Wilks points out that the goals of persons are constrained by their bodies. Nobody could pursue both the goal of becoming a ballet dancer and a sumo wrestler. So the body provides an underlying unity. So I guess the very fact then that Christine Beauchamp had only one body meant that these many personalities had to find a degree of compromise and overlap. You can't have totally different psychologies in one body. Again, I think this is a not so convincing argument. I mean, we can similarly say that the goals of persons are constrained by their cultures or their environments. There are significant limits on what I'm able to do just in virtue of where I live, right? Because I couldn't pursue both the goal of becoming a CEO and a sort of highly skilled hunter-gatherer, maybe. But that doesn't give us any reason to suppose that I'm therefore in some sense the same person as the other people who live where I do. Third, Wilks points out that despite the fact that each alternate personality was worthy of moral consideration, we wouldn't we wouldn't say that Prince was guilty of murder, right? Prince tried to kill them and restore B2, but in killing B1 and B4, he wasn't guilty of murder. Indeed, the restoration of the original personality is the basic goal of treatment for multiple personality cases. If the alternate personalities are genuine people, then that would imply that they have rights, like the right to life. It would be wrong to kill them. So with this argument, I think, again, there are some pretty clear problems here. It might be helpful to consider, there's a famous article by Judith Jarvis Thompson on abortion. I won't review Thompson's argument here, but for those who are familiar with the article, you know that one of her conclusions is that we can grant that the fetus is a person and that the fetus has a right to life, and yet still it's morally acceptable for a pregnant woman to abort the fetus. And this is because the woman's right to bodily autonomy trumps the fetus's right to life. And so I think we can say the same thing with multiple personality disorder. Sally, B1 and B4 really were separate people, and they did all have a right to life, but it's Christine Beauchamp's body. And Beauchamp is under no obligation to give up control of her own body to these other people, even if that means that they will die. So I'm not really convinced by Wilks's objections to the multiple persons thesis. But Wilks, anyway, what Wilks concludes is that there are very good reasons for assuming that Beauchamp was many people, and there are also good reasons for assuming that she was only one person. Ultimately, Wilks says that there's no fact of the matter whether Beauchamp was one person or a plurality. She thinks that the concept of a person simply breaks down in this case. So she holds there's really just no answer. But in the final part of her paper, which I think is really interesting, Wilks asks, how much unity should we expect in a single person anyway? Perhaps even normal people are actually quite disunified, and we don't have to conceive of people as having kind of perfectly coherent psychological connections. She discusses the attitudes to people that were held in ancient Greece around the time of Homer. She doesn't really go into much detail here, but I found a bit more detail in Julian James's book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, which I would bear in mind is a very controversial book. His interpretation of ancient Greece psychology is heavily contested. But this perhaps provides a different way of thinking about people, about personhood. So, according to James, in ancient Greece, people were not really seen to have much psychological or even bodily unity. Indeed, there was no word for mind or body. People were seen as a collection of independent psychological and physical parts. And these different psychological parts might have competing, even contradictory motivations. Some of the psychological parts postulated by the Greeks were, first, the thumos. This is essentially a response that precedes violent activity. Today we would say that this is the stress or fight or flight response. It involves the release of adrenaline, the increase of energy, muscles tensing ready for action, and so on. Second, the phrenes. This referred to the breathing rate or the pattern of sensations associated with respiratory changes. Third, the credi. This refers to the action of the heart. Note that even today we still talk about acting with the heart, not with the head. If Frank meets a woman and they've only known each other for 2 weeks, but they fall in love and decide to run off to another country together, we would say that they're acting with their hearts, not with their heads. Fourth, the etor. This is the sensations of the stomach. Again, this is perhaps still found in the modern world with our concept of gut reactions. You meet somebody, but there's something funny about them. You just don't trust them, but you can't say why. And that's a gut reaction. The crucial point, there were others, by the way, but these are just 4 examples of the different psychological parts. The crucial point is that the Greeks had no concept of a unified mind or soul. It's not a mind that experiences motivations and emotions, but these various parts. Let's consider an example. Suppose you come back home and you see your wife having sex with another person. Well, then the Greeks might say that your thumos becomes jealous and ready to fight, while grief comes to the credi due to the loss of your relationship, while the etor perhaps is afraid of the fight. The etor wants to avoid the fight, maybe because the other man is clearly stronger and would beat you up. So here the thumos wants one thing and the etor doesn't want it. The 2 different psychological parts are competing, and the action you take will depend on which of these parts ultimately provides the stronger push, the stronger motivation. So for the Greeks, what we today call the mind was really just a kind of aggregate of often competing psychological modules. And from this point of view, cases like Christine Beauchamp would maybe not be so surprising, because even a normal person isn't really unified. There's no kind of unity even with normal people. So perhaps we don't have to think of ourselves as unified. There are other ways of conceiving of personhood. So that's something that might be interesting to think about. But that's all I'll say about that here. I want to turn now to the second paper. This is by Jeanette Kennett and Steve Matthews. This is called Identity, Control and Responsibility, the Case of Dissociative Identity Disorder. as I said, these days it's called dissociative identity disorder, but Kennett and Matthews are talking about the same condition that Wilks talks about. Now, the primary question for this paper is, can we hold a person with dissociative identity disorder morally or legally responsible for actions committed by an alternate personality? The basic challenge here, of course, is that alternate personalities may do illegal things. Kennett and Matthews cite the example of a woman called Denny Schaffer who kidnapped a baby from a hospital and claimed that the baby was her own. When she was caught, she turned out to be a person with dissociative identity disorder. The original personality, who was called Bridget, successfully argued in court that she shouldn't be held responsible for Denny Schaffer's actions because Denny Schaffer is a different person. But is Denny Schaffer a different person? Well, as we noted when discussing the Wilks paper, there are two views we might take on this. Kennett and Matthews reject the claim that dissociative identity disorder involves multiple persons in one body. They would say that in the case of someone like Christine Beauchamp, B1, B2, B4 and Sally were not separate persons, they were altered states of one person. So on this view it looks like Bridget's defence doesn't work. There's only one person here, Bridget. Bridget herself committed the kidnapping. She can't shift the blame onto somebody else. She can't say, oh well, it was Denny Schaffer who did it, because Denny Schaffer just is Bridget. Nevertheless, Kennett and Matthews think that we should not hold Bridget responsible for the kidnapping, and this is because when a person with dissociative identity disorder is in an altered state, she, and I quote, does not possess the relevant capacities of judgment and control with respect to that state. Basically, Kennett and Matthews argue that dissociative identity disorder is a kind of global self-delusion. It's a very serious delusion. When a person is in an altered state, she is deluded about who she is. And this is essentially the same kind of delusion as would be involved in other serious mental illnesses, and hence it's not appropriate to blame her for any transgressions committed while in that state. She's criminally insane. The argument is basically that when a person is in an altered personality state, that person has false beliefs about the person she is. She is deluded about her tastes, her goals, her beliefs, her moods and attitudes. So Sally, in scare quotes of course, Sally was just Christine Beauchamp, right? There's no other person there. It's just one person, Christine Beauchamp. But in those times when Christine Beauchamp was calling herself Sally, she was under the grip of a serious delusion. When we say that Sally, but not Christine Beauchamp, was flirtatious, irresponsible, badly educated and so on, that's a misdescription. What we should say is that during the times when she used the name Sally, Christine Beauchamp was under the delusion that she was flirtatious, irresponsible and badly educated. In fact, Christine Beauchamp was never badly educated. She was very well educated. But there were times when she was under the delusion that she was badly educated. We've already seen some of Wilks's arguments for thinking that dissociative identity disorder involves only one person, not many. But Kennett and Matthews make a couple of other additional points that I think are quite interesting. So first of all, we have to keep in mind that dissociative identity disorder is a mental illness, and perhaps we can shed some light on its nature by comparing it to other mental illnesses. And they think that when we place dissociative identity disorder in the context of other mental illnesses, it makes the one-person theory more plausible. First, consider schizophrenia. Schizophrenia involves very serious delusions. Some of them are delusions about things happening in the external world. For instance, patients might become paranoid that the government is spying on them. But many schizophrenics are also deluded about themselves. So a common one is that many schizophrenics believe they are secret agents, so something like that. Another interesting delusion is what's known as thought insertion. This is the delusional belief that the thoughts occurring in your mind are not your thoughts. So thoughts come to your head, but you feel as though they have been projected into your mind by a malicious external agent. And that's, I think, an interesting comparison to dissociative identity disorder. Schizophrenics experience a lack of identification with their present thoughts. In a similar way, in dissociative identity disorder, people experience a lack of identification with their past thoughts. One personality will claim not to identify with the thoughts of others, as Sally claimed not to identify with the thoughts of B1. So that's maybe an interesting overlap, right? In schizophrenia, you have a delusion about the self. So people will be deluded about, what their job is or whatever. They'll think that they're, secret agents, and they'll even have the delusion that thoughts in their mind are not their thoughts. Perhaps even more telling is bipolar disorder, which I think in some ways it comes across as a kind of less extreme case of dissociative identity disorder. In bipolar disorder, the patient suddenly switches from one extreme to the other. In the manic state, the patient may believe that she is incredibly talented, immune to danger, wealthy. She may change from being a teetotaler to being a heavy drinker. She may change from being introverted and mild-mannered to outgoing, arrogant, promiscuous. She might make rash decisions, like she quits her job and decides to go for a trip around South America. She'll be constantly hyperactive. The way you won't be able to understand what she's saying because she speaks so fast. Things like that. This manic state can persist for weeks or even months. After this, she may suddenly switch into a depressed state, and this involves a complete loss of interest in activities that were previously enjoyed. It involves feelings of self-loathing and guilt, thoughts of suicide, loss of appetite, changes in sleep patterns, so either sleeping too much or hardly sleeping at all, and so on. And so I think this is really quite similar to dissociative identity disorder. The shift from the manic phase to the depressive phase can be very radical. Everything about the person changes. Yet with bipolar disorder, we don't postulate multiple people in one body. We're happy to say that a single person can have alternate personalities because this is a case of mental disorder, and a single person can be in a delusional or altered state. So that, I think, is one kind of interesting point, that when we see dissociative identity disorder in the context of other mental illnesses, the idea that this claim that it's actually one person in a deluded state is maybe a bit more plausible. Another point that's quite interesting is that when we examine dissociative identity cases closely, generally the alter personalities are not robust, they're not well-rounded. Alters tend to be highly specialised and stereotypical, rather like stock characters. Think about B1. She was moral, religious, reserved, very delicate. She was a stereotypical saint. Sally was just the opposite. Outgoing, promiscuous, flirtatious, irresponsible. She was a woman of loose morals. These are Victorian-era stereotypes. Now, if you met Sally for a few minutes, you'd probably think that she was normal. But if you knew her for a very long time, you'd find that she lacks the rich nuances of character that real people have. Or so Kennett and Matthews suggest. They suggest that, in general, when people have this dissociative identity disorder, the personalities that come out are very thin. They're thin, stereotypical, stock characters. Kennett and Matthews quote the psychiatrist David Spiegel. He says that the psychopathology of dissociative identity disorder is a failure of integration of various aspects of identity, memory, and consciousness. The problem is not having more than one personality. It is having less than one personality. Alternate personalities are not persons, they are fragments of persons. And the job of the psychiatrist is to try to get those fragments together into an integrated whole. So to sum up where Kennett and Matthews stand, they think that dissociative identity disorder does not create multiple people. There is one person who suffers from very extreme delusional states. And this is, by the way, why the name change happened. The term multiple personality disorder carries the implication that there are, multiple personalities. It was altered to dissociative identity disorder partly to reflect this point that we should instead see it as involving less than one personality. But of course, the consequence of this, as we noted earlier, is that in cases of dissociative identity disorder, You can't say that if an alter personality committed a crime, that it was a different person who did that crime. So the defence that Bridget used doesn't work. But Kennett and Matthews, as noted, they think that people with this disorder are not responsible, and we can now say, having reviewed their view of this disorder, we can now say in a bit more detail why they're not responsible for crimes. First of all, the individual can't control the slide into the altered state. This point is quite obvious. The state comes without warning. There's nothing that you can do about entering an altered state, so it wouldn't make much sense to blame them for that. Second, the altered state may be one in which the sufferer's capacity to appreciate moral reasons will be diminished. So, when a person is in an altered state, she can't draw on the reasons she would have were she not in that state. For instance, the altered personality might simply not care about conventional moral norms, whereas the original person does. Or rather, to put it more accurately, the person will be under the delusion that she doesn't care about moral norms, right? She'll be under the delusion that moral norms don't matter to her, or she will be under the delusion that she has different moral values to what she actually has. So because she's under that delusion, she's not able to act based on moral norms, right? When Bridget kidnapped the baby, she was under the delusion that she just didn't care about these standard moral norms that say you can't kidnap people, and because of that delusion, it doesn't make sense. You can't blame her. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there are too few of the normal psychological connections between different stages of the person's life to permit normal self-control. Basically, a person with dissociative identity disorder has severely diminished autonomy. And I think this point about autonomy is crucial. Kennett and Matthews say, and I quote, "Autonomous agents are agents who possess the capacity to shape, plan and direct their own lives. This involves making plans and commitments to doing certain things in the future. If I tell you that I will meet you for a drink on Friday evening, then you have a reasonable expectation that on Friday I will remember saying that and I will feel bound by the commitment I made. And because of this, it makes sense to hold me morally responsible if I fail to meet you. You would at least demand an explanation, right? Why didn't you turn up?" Now, clearly, an individual who can't make commitments like this, who sort of can't commit herself to making future actions, she can't participate properly in social and moral life. She has diminished autonomy. But when a sufferer of dissociative identity disorder is in an altered state, she can't later remember or buy into commitments she made when she was in that state. So we can understand dissociative identity disorder as involving a single person losing their autonomy. Of course, the loss of autonomy doesn't in itself exculpate dissociative identity disorder sufferers from moral responsibility, because when people expect to lose autonomy at some point in the future, there are strategies of self-control. You can take an action now to ensure that you won't do the wrong thing later when you're, so you can, even though you may have states of diminished autonomy, you can kind of take actions now to prevent yourself from doing the wrong thing. And if you fail to use such strategies, then you can be held responsible for actions committed while in the state of diminished autonomy. For example, suppose I often drive when I get drunk. In a sober state, I understand that drinking and driving is wrong. But when I get drunk, I become very arrogant and I believe that I'm a great driver. Now, I can be held responsible for drinking and driving because before getting drunk, there are sort of strategies available to me to prevent myself from drinking and driving. So first of all, I might change my internal motivations. I might simply try to prevent myself from ever getting drunk again, say by going to Alcoholics Anonymous or by promising myself rewards if I don't drink. Second, I can change external circumstances so that even if I do get drunk, driving isn't possible. For instance, if I plan on going out partying, I can take the bus and leave my car at home. Now the problem is that these kinds of strategies are not in general available to people with dissociative identity disorder. So regarding the first strategy, if I'm in an altered personality, I may not remember attending Alcoholics Anonymous, and if I do remember, I may not believe that it was me who went. I will believe that it was somebody else who was in my body. It's not possible really for sort of one personality to change the motivations of another, because they're different personalities, right? The fact that Frank has gone to Alcoholics Anonymous will have no effect on Vincent, some other person's motivation to drink. Similarly, the fact that Frank has gone to Alcoholics Anonymous will have no effect on Frank's own motivation to drink if Frank is later under the delusion that he is a different person called Vincent. As for the second strategy, this only works if I have control over when the state of diminished autonomy occurs. So I can say to myself, well, I know that I'll be getting drunk later this evening, so I'll make sure that at that time I have no access to my car. But as noted, in dissociative identity disorder, alter personalities can emerge at any time without warning. You can't plan for the emergence of an alter personality in the way you can plan for a night out getting drunk. Right, so those were a couple of papers on dissociative identity disorder. I think it's a very interesting condition, and I think it's worth thinking about this in some detail, because we will want any theory of personal identity to be able to capture these cases, right? And I mean, as we've seen in the other videos, we have used multiple personality cases to criticize or support particular theories of personal identity. So getting clear about what's involved in these cases is, I think, quite important. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.